This is Dave Meltzer, and we're doing a career interview with me on Great North Wrestling. Check it out right now.
All right, so we're with Dave Meltzer here, who I guess writes the New York Times of professional wrestling, the most credible wrestling reporter out there. And I just wanted to ask you to start, were you always a wrestling fan growing up?
I mean, since the age of 10, I was a wrestling fan. My friends actually started watching wrestling when I was growing up before me, and we just kind of hung out, and what we would do on Saturday afternoons is we'd play baseball and watch wrestling. So yeah, and from week one, from the very first TV show I saw, I think I was pretty much hooked on it.
How did you get into pro wrestling journalism?
Well, I would have been a writer no matter what, and I started right away. You know, I was always writing about baseball and basketball, and I didn't really know pro wrestling. And then I started watching pro wrestling, so I wrote. I sent in a newsletter. I wrote a newsletter, and then I sent it in to Jim Melby, believe it or not, and he plugged it in one of the wrestling magazines, and I started getting some subscribers, and from there, that's kind of what happened.
And is it true you almost gave up around 85 because you were getting frustrated or something?
Yeah, well, I mean, there was a couple of things that happened in the 80s in the sense of, you know, you're out of college and you have to make money, and you have to, so I got a job with a soccer magazine. So at that point, it was kind of like I almost gave it up. And very close, and then I kind of scaled back a little bit, and then when I scaled back, it seemed to work okay, so I kind of stuck with it. And then in '86, I got a job with a newspaper, and I had to make a decision in '86 or '87 of, you know, either I was going to do one or the other because I didn't have enough time to do both. And I chose the wrestling, which made no sense at the time, and I'm sure if I made the decision now, I wouldn't have done it, but it ended up being the right decision. So so that's really what happened.
How did you find your sources when you began? Because there was no internet around. It would have been pretty difficult.
Actually, it was wrestlers. You know, wrestlers would tell me kind of like what was happening in the area, and they liked reading. You know, it was the ability to talk to some guys and get like accurate gates. Remember, the guys were paid by gates, and the business was so full of it, right? So I was able to get like gates from different cities. So wrestlers are kind of looking, oh, this territory is doing well, this territory is not doing well. And then I would kind of like talk about who was doing well and things in different territories. So it was actually wrestlers, and then very quickly a couple promoters started talking to me. And then it just kind of became a lot, you know, a lot of people didn't talk to me, but a lot of people did.
Is it true that Paul Bosch actually helped you a little bit learn the business?
A little bit. I mean, I was already doing the newsletter for a couple of years when I first met with Paul Bosch. But Paul Bosch was really good as far as, you know, just telling stories about wrestling and giving advice on what not to believe. You know what I mean? He would just say, like, they'll tell you this, this, and this, and it's like, don't believe it. So he was very helpful in giving me, you know, like little bits of advice, I would say, yeah.
And when did you start coming to the big events? Because you used to start coming to pay-per-views and so forth.
Yeah, so that would have been when I started making a little bit of money. So I would say that's probably 88, 89 on a regular basis, yeah.
And at one of the pay-per-views, I believe Jim Ross pointed out that you were there.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Apparently the Chinatown Rumble or something like that?
Chinatown Rumble?
Yeah.
I don't think so. I was sitting next to Brad Muster, but I don't think I was actually pointed out.
Okay.
Yeah, Brad Muster was pointed out. He was a really good friend. He's still a good friend of mine. He was played for the Chicago Bears. He was a first round draft choice, so we were sitting together in the front row. But I don't remember. I mean, maybe he pointed out.
It's written on the internet, so I don't know.
Yeah, I was there. I was there, and there's pictures of me cheering during the Flair Steamboat match and all that. But I don't know that I was pointed out on the show. But Brad certainly was. You know, yeah.
And what was the backlash like from some wrestlers? Because I'm sure there was still kayfabe around in those days.
Yeah,
some must have been mad.
Yeah, some of the wrestlers were mad. Some of the promoters were mad. It was. I think more were mad than probably happy about it. But in time, you know, it just became part of the business. I think it became an important part of the business in time, actually. You know, because it made people accountable for what they did. Like if somebody was false advertising, you know, I would just say it. You know, like, or if guys were, you know. That was just the thing. I was just kind of covering like I would cover politics, and I'd covered politics before, and I covered sports before, so I just kind of looked at I'm covering like sports and politics.
Were you ever threatened?
I mean, yes, but not in a way that I would be you know, on the phone, I'm going to kill you for what you'd said, but no, not really. Like in person, no.
And I'm just going to ask you about some people. Billy Graham, I think you know, is pretty good friends with me. What do you think of him and his legacy in the business?
He was a real innovator. You know, Billy Graham is probably more than anyone else the guy who made me a fan, because when I talked about how I was hooked on the first show, it's because of Billy Graham's interview. You know, Billy Graham and Pat Patterson did interviews, and Ray Stevens, and where they were all together in San Francisco. But it was Billy Graham interview. I was like, really, oh God, this guy's my favorite wrestler. So, you know, and I became good friends with him later. But yeah, as far as like being an innovative character and leading to so many people, Paul Heyman, DDP, Hulk Hogan, Jesse Ventura, I mean, they all became big fans. Billy Graham was a really important figure in the history of the business that a lot of people don't realize now, you know, and a big trendsetter in a lot of ways. So,
Is he the first guy to call himself superstar?
That I'm aware of, yeah, because Bill Dundee, I remember Superstar Bill Dundee, but Billy Graham was first, off of Jesus Christ Superstar.
Yeah. And do you think that it was a bad move to switch the title to Backlund when they did, when Billy was getting really hot and borderline becoming a babyface almost in some cases?
Yeah, I mean, I would, you know, I was a lot younger when that happened, but so it's hard for me at that time to have the perspective, because when it was going on, I mean, the reality is that I knew when Billy won the title, I already knew that Bob was getting the title. It was just a question of when, and it was, you know, about 9 months or so later, 9-10 months. So when it happened, it was like, well, it's going to happen. And I didn't really understand at that time. So at that time, no, I wouldn't say, I didn't really understand the business. I was a teenager. I wasn't doing the newsletter yet. The idea of, you know, he was selling out the Garden every time, and business was so good under Billy. And then but Vince Sr. had already made the plans. I mean, their idea was always a babyface champion. And normally they would only give the heel, you know, a couple of weeks. But with Billy, I think they just went with the idea of going longer. And Billy was such a great drawing card at the time. You know, that whole period was tremendous, and he would go everywhere with the belt, just outside the territory.
Is it true he had the highest percentage of Madison Square Garden sellouts?
Yes, because he sold out every Garden show except for one, and that was like Peter Maivia with 18,000, which was almost sold out. So yeah, he had the highest percentage of sellouts of any champion that they ever had. And so by that token, if I look back based on the business and being successful and everything, they probably should have gone longer with him, but they had already promised it to Bob, and Bob was Vince Sr.'s guy, and so it happened. Vince Jr. told me that, you know, he thought it should have gone longer to Billy, you know, I mean, later. I think if Vince Jr. was in charge at the time, because Vince Jr. did, you know, I mean, they had their ups and downs over the years, but at that time, you know, Hulk Hogan was the whole Hulk Hogan thing came from Billy Graham.
Right.
And so, and that's Vince Jr.'s kind of wrestler. So he had told me that, you know, he thought that they should have gone longer with him. So I think you could make that case. I mean, the babyface turn, I mean, he'd gotten over huge as a babyface because he had all that charisma. And it was probably the time to do it, maybe even a couple months later, but yeah, it never happened.
And just to get into Crockett Promotions a bit, whose fault do you think it was that the business was bad more? Was it Dusty's booking decisions, or Jim Crockett's poor business decisions, or a combination of
It was
both?
a lot of things. They were fighting an uphill fight, and they did pretty well for a couple of years. I mean, they had the better talent, but they had so many disadvantages, you know, in the sense of Vince had the better TV at the time. Vince was in New York, they were in Charlotte. They tried to move to Dallas, you know, but it really wasn't a Dallas-based promotion. They ended up spending a lot of money, and they went with they had this great talent, but they went with the Pat Hand in the same matches over and over again, and you can't do that for a long period of time, so it's going to go down. So some of it was the booking and not mixing new people in, but they were still fighting an uphill battle the whole time. I mean, the fact that they were able to go equal to Vince, especially when Vince had Hogan, in some cities for a long time, is really a credit. But they didn't have the money to compete with Vince, and inevitably, you know, the Turner thing. Now the Turner thing, you know, they should have beaten Vince. They had the money and they had the resources to beat Vince, and they didn't beat Vince because, you know, at the beginning they didn't really try to beat Vince. At the beginning they were just trying to keep wrestling on television and just be number two and not lose money. And by not losing money, they ended up losing a ton of money. Then they ended up being very successful when they really started fighting Vince, and then they self-destructed.
Did they actually ever have a year of profits?
They had probably 2 or 3 years of
2 years
profits.
of profits.
Yeah. I think 96, 97, 98 were all profitable, and then 99 it started going down.
What was the biggest loss year? We've heard a lot of numbers.
62, and that would be 2000.
62 million.
Yeah, in 2000.
And so that would have been a combination of Bischoff and Russo booking? Or?
They were there at one point. The die was already cast before. And they were just on the way down. I mean, the mistakes started being made in '98, and the whole year of '99 was a disaster. But the first half or 2/3 of the first half or so of '99, just because they had so much momentum, they were actually still making money, but the thing was going down at a fast rate. And then by the end of '99, they were in the bottom, and they couldn't dig their way out.
And you always hear, and I don't really like this excuse, that it was Ted Turner going out of power that ultimately put it out of business. But would they have kept it in business if it had been making money?
Of course they would have. It'd be in business today if it was a profitable thing. It was doing the ratings at the peak. That you'd never take a show that was doing that kind of ratings off it. The ratings nosedived, the attendance nosedived. Again, they lost $60 million, and in those days, wrestling wasn't the type of a business where a Turner Broadcasting is going to go, oh yeah, we're fine with losing $60 million with this kind of ratings, and the ratings were nosediving. It just was, lawsuits. It was just a disaster. So I mean, that's what killed it. I mean, had different management been in place, could Eric Bischoff have turned it around? It's a question that we'll never know because he never had the chance to do so. So I don't have that answer. But the idea that Ted losing, what killed the business was losing all that money. I mean, they were willing to sell it, and then they hired a programmer, and the programmer didn't want wrestling anymore, and that's what ended up killing it. But if wrestling had been, the highest rated show on the station, you could hire some new programmer in, and you're not, if you have a company that's making $30 million a year or $50 million a year, and doing the best ratings of the station on 2 stations at the same time, that new programmer is going to go in there and go, I don't like wrestling, but goddamn, it's making us money. You know that.
And I have to ask your thoughts on Vince Russo.
In what sense?
As a booker in general.
Well, he obviously had a successful run when he was working with Vince McMahon, and then when he wasn't working with Vince McMahon, he was never that successful, and I think that's just what happened. He didn't fit well with WCW. I don't think Vince Russo understood the big picture of wrestling at all. I think that, I think he was very good at coming up with ideas, and there were times where I would watch, when he was with TNA, I would watch interviews, and I go, for certain characters, I thought he was very good at scripting the interviews with them. So I go, he's talented there. With the women, I thought he made them all trashy, so I thought that was like a negative. But in the big picture in TNA, it was far more negative than positive. And WCW, it was really negative. I think when he came in, I think it was salvageable, but he went in the direction that was not going to save it. He went to, I'm not saying you go with long matches and things like that or traditional wrestling, but when every match is a run in and nothing means anything and you're just trying to hit people over the head with stuff, they're going to burn out on it real quick. And also, he was catering to a different audience, and it was just a different time. And he didn't have Vince McMahon. Remember, when you have Vince McMahon, you have a guy with decades of experience who can tweak those angles and tweak those ideas. Perhaps if he had someone who, on there, who would be above him, who could tweak the ideas. But when people would try to give him advice, he thought he knew everything, and he didn't. And he was the guy. WCW was in bad shape when he got there, but it was in a lot worse shape very quickly, after he was there.
And one of the people that ran WCW in one of their least losing years was Bill Watts. And there's been a lot of controversy. Was he racist or not? In your opinion?
I don't know about what the racist. He said things that I would call how would I say it? I mean, he said things in the sense of a business owner should be allowed to be racist. He believed in the power of a business owner. So, I mean, it was, to me, it's like, he said, if I owned a restaurant and I didn't want to serve someone, the government shouldn't force me to do it. But it's like, I think that if you run a business, if you run a restaurant and you say, because of somebody's color or ethnicity, I'm not going to serve you, that's absolutely freaking horrible. And so I couldn't agree with that. I think that when it came to booking wrestling, no, he was not racist. Bill Watts was a guy who, when he was trying to promote wrestling, wanted to promote wrestling to the most people possible. If anything, he was he catered to ethnics more than almost anyone, because he thought that was the key to making money. So, again, personally, that's such a really hard question to answer. Some of the things he said are like I said, things he said are things I could never agree with. And and homophobic. I certainly perhaps, yeah.
And to get onto the subject of Bruiser Brody, I know you were friends with him a little bit. What was he like as a person in your dealings with him?
I can't say, like, it's more of a business thing. Like, I couldn't tell you like what kind of a guy he was. I didn't know him in that way. I just know that he was very, very smart business-wise, very, very savvy business-wise. He didn't trust promoters. But I learned from him, because I was always kind of like, learning the business and believing people, and he would be kind of like, okay, that's bullshit. That's bullshit, that's bullshit. And it was great to have someone like that who would just, like, if I would say something like this, Larry Matisic and him would just go, okay, they're saying that, but this is what it really is. And then they had so much experience in the business that they understood that. So it was like that, yeah.
So he was one of the people that helped you?
Absolutely, yeah.
Do you know who did that interview with him online that's almost an out-of-character interview? Was that...
In St. Louis,
yeah,
where he's talking about drugs? I don't know, but I remember the interview, yeah.
It seems to be like one of the first shoot interviews with...
Yeah, in a lot of ways, yeah.
It's very interesting. And what do you think of the whole situation with his death, with Jose Gonzalez?
It's horrible. And the fact that Jose, worked in the business for 30 more years, 28 years, 25 more years, and became,
worked that night.
Worked that
remained
night.
on as Booker.
Yeah, secretly Booker, and then after a couple months came back as official Booker. It was horrible. It's horrible. I mean, it was that aspect of the business was just terrible, and that was one of the worst things ever.
Do you think his wife should have at least sued WWC over that?
It was talked about, but it's like the problem is it's the same thing as the trial. You're going to sue in Puerto Rico. How are you going to collect? You're the outsider suing them. I mean, it's easy for me to say, especially now when you look back on it, that, absolutely. But is it worth spending that money when they would probably declare bankruptcy rather than pay anyway? Because they'd done that before. So probably the best thing was, not to do it, from a financial standpoint. Why spend the money that he made for the family on this lawsuit that you can't, but from a moral standpoint, should they have been sued? Yeah, and everything, yes. And if it was perhaps in the mainland or something, who knows, but it's just like the trial, you know what I mean? The trial told you a lot too.
Yeah. Well, the company's almost partly responsible because it happened in their dressing room.
It happened in their dressing room, and, the murder weapon disappeared, and all that, yeah.
Yeah, the thing that bothers me the most about it is, as he's bleeding to death, there are people just lacing up their boots, going over their matches as this is happening, because I understand that he was lying there for at least 45 minutes.
Yeah, because the ambulance didn't come quick enough, and there's the thought that if the ambulance had come quicker, perhaps, but he was stabbed in bad places. But I just remember that was what a nightmare. That whole period was like a nightmare.
And there was a big controversy over the WrestleMania 3 real attendance.
That's silly, though. I mean, it is what it is.
How did you discover that?
Well, I mean, I always thought that the number was legit, just because I had no reason not to. And then one night there was a TV special on Hulk Hogan, and Zane Breslov, who was the promoter of the event, called me up and goes, God, they said 93,000, and then it's like, I wonder if they actually believe it. And I go, isn't that real? He goes, no, it's not real. And I go, well, what's the real number? He goes, 78,000. He goes, we sold out. I mean, maybe we could have gotten 93,000, but we didn't, and it was like that. It's like, okay, that's fine. I didn't really worry about it. And then, I think I probably mentioned it or something like that. And then, several other people over the years in WWE, when we talked about it, would, said the same thing. So it's like, people go, oh, one person told him. It's like, well, one person told me first, but I've had so many other people have told me about it since. And I know it's like one of those like legendary things. I mean, I even talked to Vince about it once. I mean, it's one of those legendary things where people just don't want to believe, like Andre being 7'4". I mean, it's just like people grew up with it, and they grew up with that number being part of their religion, and probably like jiu-jitsu people who don't want to hear that Helio Gracie actually like once lost a fight. It's just like it happened, but your religion tells you it didn't, so you don't want to hear it, and you get mad at people who tell you it. You know what I mean?
And what's your opinion on the people? Bill Eadie was one of them that recently told us he thought the Montreal screw job was a work due to...
If you were a wrestler, I think you would think that. And don't think I didn't have suspicions of it but there were just everything that happened. It was pretty clear to me that it wasn't. I mean, I know from the wrestlers that worked in the company that were really furious that night, and I ended up becoming really good friends with Brett over it. Because we were not. I mean, we didn't talk or anything. It was
because he was upset because you said Ric Flair was.
Because I think Ric Flair was a better wrestler than him. Yeah. Maybe he had surpassed Rick by then, and he was really mad that I hadn't figured it out, or whatever. But and Brett's a phenomenal wrestler, one of the best that I've ever seen. So I mean, it's not like, and Rick is one of the greatest I've ever seen. So if I said Ric Flair was better than him, and maybe he was and maybe he wasn't, it's not a knock on Brett. I always, from the first time I ever saw Brett wrestle, I always thought he was a great wrestler. But
Rick accomplished more over time, certainly, I would say.
Oh, he had more longevity, yeah, and he carried territories longer and things like that. They were different. They were different types of wrestler anyway. But as far as it's not even that, just with he sent me documents, and he just, I remember the first time he just goes, I'm going to tell you all this, and he goes, and everything I'm going to tell you, in time, you're going to know that it's all true. I'm going to prove it. And everything he said pretty much was, in time, came out, like he recited the conversation in the dressing room that he had with Vince to me, and I later got the tape because he was wired, and it was, pretty much word for word what he said. I mean, everything he said was pretty much as it happened, and I know a lot of wrestlers who think that, and I think if I wasn't so close to it, I might even think it, but there's so many things that have happened over the years where it's like it's not even a doubt in my mind at all. I mean, it obviously was it's what it was.
Why did Vince let Brett use WWE footage in the Wrestling with Shadows documentary?
That was already signed on years beforehand. Like they had agreed that anything that they could shoot anything other than I think that there was maybe one or two stipulations of what they couldn't shoot, and so yeah, that's how the knockout thing. It's like, boy, did they. WWE was when the scene of Vince walking out all stunned. They did everything in the world to try to keep that one out of the thing, and the producer, they wouldn't make that deal. They just go, no, it's staying in, and they had the right. But it did hurt because Vince also, when the movie was done, the movie would have gone perfect on TBS or TNT because he hadn't sold it to an American distributor.
Right.
But because Vince did have the right when they negotiated, the one thing that it couldn't be is on the Turner stations. So it ended up being on A&E.
Oh, I see. And you were talking to me earlier, Owen Hart. What do you think of that whole tragedy and the show continuing on after the death?
It was horrible. The show continuing on was a bad decision. But again, who prepares for that? I don't have I think they made a huge mistake. I think that for the image of wrestling at the time, and everyone's forgotten, it's not a long-term thing, but at the time, I would see people and they go, I can't believe they kept the show going after the guy died. And it's like, it was the wrong decision to make. I think that if it happened now, they would stop the show for sure. But, they had no prerequisite over it. And I think I got mad because they kept trying to defend it and saying, if we stopped the show, people would riot. And I was like, they stop baseball games for rain and nobody riots. They stop. You know what I mean? It's like, there was something. It
wasn't really a great pay-per-view either, was it? I can't even remember what the main event.
It was.
Was it over the edge?
It was over the edge, and I don't even remember. The whole show was a blur after that anyway. But I think them defending it, and I was like, no, I don't buy your defense. But now, it's like I did understand that you're not prepared, and Vince is so single-minded and all that. I understand it, disagree with it.
And another bad thing that happened in wrestling was the unfortunate Chris Benoit murders. And I'm just wondering, there's been so many reasons given as to what happened with him snapping. I know you probably talked to him a bit. What was your opinion?
I don't have the answer. No, I think everything that you talk about probably all fits in. I'll never understand it. No matter what, with the concussions. I'll never understand him killing his son under any circumstances. A 7-year-old. No matter what, I don't. Obviously, if you hear the stories from people from Sandra, who's Nancy's sister.
Yeah, I heard that
when she did the thing on the Jericho show, And that was really interesting to me, you know, going through all those details. I mean, I had talked to her and she had said some stuff to me, but never in that great of a detail. So it was very fascinating. But even so, I'm still left with the idea. I know some people are the concussion thing, and I'm sure it has something to do with it. And it's a good answer for a lot of people going like, well, see, we have our answer. But I don't have an answer. And it's frustrating because of what happened, and also because, you know, I wasn't like close with Chris Benoit or anything like that, but I did know him since he was 19 years old. You know, he'd be someone who I would see and was nicer to me than most. And, you know, I'd met him in Japan on when he first had gone there, and went to dinner a couple times. And, you know, we were just like two Americans in Japan together. Well, he's Canadian, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, two foreigners in Japan together, and he knew the language a little bit, and just a very nice guy to me. So it's kind of like you kind of know this guy who you kind of know, and he's a really nice guy, and a guy you greatly respect, because as a performer, Chris is one of the greatest wrestlers I ever saw. And then this happens, and it's you know, how do you rationalize it? And there is, I still have, I have great problems with it, you know.
Because as the sister was saying, it was a very brutal scene afterwards.
It was horrible, you know. Yeah, that only makes it worse. And then he brutally killed himself in a way that, you know, nobody would brutally kill themselves. You know, if you ever heard of someone killing themselves, I mean, there's a lot of ways people have killed themselves, but I never heard of anyone killing themselves the way he did. You know, it was a torturous, horrible way to die. I mean, you could shoot yourself in the head and be gone. I mean, he was out there, I mean, trying to, you know, strangle himself in the most horrible way possible.
And is it true that the WWE Network is airing some of his stuff again now?
Yeah. When it's on the Raws and the Nitros. I mean, they don't promote it or anything like that, but his footage is definitely there, because I know people who watch the shows all the time, and they have not edited the Benoit stuff out.
And for Global Force Wrestling, is that pretty much non-existent now, or are they still around?
There's a name. I mean, you know, they're either going to get TV or they're not, and they haven't gotten TV, which tells you how difficult it is. They shot 13 weeks of TV, but they never were able to get a station for it, which is, you know, the more outlets wrestling has, the better. I wish the best for them, but they didn't get TV.
And what about TNA? What's the latest news on what's going on with TNA?
It's always changing. You know, they've got the TV deal. They seem to be sort of steadying in the ratings. There's a little bit. Matt Hardy's got a little bit of buzz on him right now. So they're around. I mean, you know, they're in a tough financial situation, but they've got TV, and I think as long as they got TV, people will kind of try to keep them going. I mean, Dixie may have to take in, you know, a new ownership and things like that, and sell some of the company, or however she's going to do to finance the thing to keep going. But you know, they're reacting like it's business as usual.
And you've been involved with UFC coverage since UFC 1. Are you surprised at how UFC has evolved over the years and how big it's become?
Yes, I knew it had potential to be very big. I mean, I thought when Lorenzo and Dana bought it in 2001, I thought that, okay, once you get it back on pay-per-view, you're going to be smooth sailing. And it actually took them 4 years to get smooth sailing. So I thought, you know, it'll be there, and it'll be, you know, I thought it'd be kind of like a number 3 wrestling promotion, like bigger than an ECW, but not as big as like WCW and WWE were. And it ended up being, in some ways, bigger than WWE, in other ways the same. But you know, on that level. But the big events, you know, and the nature of how big as stars that Conor McGregor became, and Ronda Rousey and all that, I didn't foresee it. I didn't foresee it being that big, to where it's, you know, it's really. Even in 2005, I remember something going like, "Do you think that like in 10 years it can be stronger than boxing?" And I said, "No, because boxing's established. You know, it's like it'll be strong, but you know, it may take 30 years to be stronger than boxing." And it was probably stronger than boxing a year later. So yeah,
the payoffs have not got as big overall, though, for the performers.
No.
Unfortunately,
it's they have more control. Boxing was so you know, once you had the Ali and the kind of money that he made, and then it just started building and building as the revenue kept building, and the main event fighters, the real key fighters, were able to get huge money, whereas UFC was able to keep it down. But the fighters are, you know, unhappy about it, and you know, they're being sued. I don't know what's going to happen. But the pay has gradually grown, but it's still, on a percentage, it's still too low.
And what's going on with Brock Lesnar, speaking of UFC?
He failed test for clomiphene.
Is it official that he failed it now?
Yes, he failed 2 tests actually. Failed one on June 28th and one on July the 9th, which was the day of his fight. So he's probably going to look at a 2-year suspension from MMA, but he'll still do WWE. But I think his MMA may be over, which is too bad because he brought a lot of excitement to MMA. He wasn't the greatest technical fighter, but he was a strong wrestler, and he had a strong name value, and people tuned in to see him.
And WWE is not going to be suspending him. That's official. So it's different for the part-time performers, the testing policy?
I guess so. Different for Brock Lesnar.
I guess probably The Rock as well.
The Rock as well, I would say probably, yeah. I never imagined, that when Rock shows up, that they go, by the way, you're being tested. I never even thought of that for a second that was possible. I mean, it's just.
So does that mean probably Vince McMahon and Triple H are probably under?
Well, Vince, I know. Vince himself said it. When Vince testified before Congress, they go like, he was a performer. He go, do you get tested? And he was the thing, I'm 62 years old or whatever he was at the time. He goes, it's not, So like that, it's like, no. And I don't, Triple H, I don't believe that he's tested either, yeah.
And what was it like covering all that steroid trial? Because that was a pretty...
That was pretty intense.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was. I'm glad I went. I learned a lot about the justice system. They really didn't have strong. They really never should have had the trial. Honestly, when I look back at it, they didn't have the evidence to get Vince. I mean, yes, everybody was on steroids. We know that, but they didn't have enough to tie Vince in. They almost did. They came very close, but they didn't have what they didn't have enough to me for a trial. If a few things had worked out differently, in the sense that Linda McMahon was tipped off that they were after Zahorian, and if she wasn't tipped off, they probably would have hired Zahorian as their doctor, in which case you're hiring the drug guy, and you're knowingly hiring the drug guy because he's the guy who you're getting your own, Vince was getting his own steroids from Zahorian. So you tie that in, at that point, I think they would have been liable as hell. And I think that the trial may have had a good chance of going in the other direction. But before they actually hired him, they had gotten word Zahorian's hot, back away, and they backed away. And they never hired him officially. So, I mean, he was assigned to them by the commission. So, but then the commission stopped assigning the doctor, and the WWE was going to be in charge of hiring the doctor. When the commission assigned him, Vince and everyone were getting the steroids from the guy. So they all knew who he was. And Vince couldn't say, I didn't know, because he was one of the guys getting the steroids from him, and they were sending the steroids to Vince's office for him and Hogan. So had they hired him, and they were, I mean, it's documented, they were going to hire him. He was on the list to be hired. One of the employees goes, we shouldn't hire him, this guy's a drug dealer. And the top people, Linda and Pat Patterson, said, no, he's in. And then before the first show that he was going to work for them, they got the word, and it's like, oh, he's out. And so that was the difference between, the verdict going one way or the other.
And just to go back a bit to Lesnar, that story reminded me of something. Wasn't he arrested for something to do with steroids in the early 2000s or human? There was
an arrest when he was in OVW, and the charges were dropped because when they analyzed the substance, it wasn't steroids. They thought it was steroids. I don't know why they were there investigating, but they found something in his apartment or wherever. He did get arrested. They tested it, and what it was. Whatever it was, I mean, I've heard it was growth hormone, and I've heard it was just like a liquid supplement. And the police never said what it was, but because it was not anything illegal, whatever he had was not illegal.
Growth hormone isn't illegal, I guess?
I thought it was, but whatever it was, It was dropped. So that's what happened, yeah.
Okay. And what do you think wrestling's going to have to do to become more popular again? I know they're getting big crowds for the big shows,
right.
But overall, they're not really coming to most of the towns as much as they used to in North America.
Yeah, it's just a question of, it's hard because of just the nature of so much television anyway. But I think that the key is another Steve Austin comes, another Jim Londos comes, another Hulk Hogan comes. You know what I mean? And that's Bruno Sammartino. It's usually when you look at that, that's when the business comes, is when you've got somebody like that. Now, can they make a guy like that? It's pretty hard. But if they do, yeah, there's no reason it can't. There's no reason it can't be big, because you got exposure, and which is the key is exposure and talent, and making larger than life stars. And right now, they got a lot of really talented guys, but they don't have the larger-than-life stars.
Right. And the draft, what's your opinion of how that turned out in the end?
I thought it was pretty uncreative, honestly.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was my, when I'm watching it, I'm thinking of like, God, they could do this, they could do this, they could do this. And they really didn't do anything of the sort. I think that they kind of like in their minds kind of thought of like the order it's going to go. And I think they put a lot of thought into that, but they could have done more. But it's a draft. I mean, it's you know, it's what you do now. I think that the bringing back of Daniel Bryan and Shane McMahon being on SmackDown, I like that dynamic because the fans really like them and you need that on that show. And I think SmackDown, at first, you know, as Tuesday showed, I think SmackDown will be a stronger show at first. A year from now, it's either, you know, it's going to be how they execute everything from here on in. If they allow the guys, and they're going to try, if the guys that were, you know, the Dolph Ziggler level guys are going to be forced to be higher because there's less depth on the brand. So if those guys, if the fans, if they promote them in a good way and the fans are willing to accept them at a high level, because you know you typecast guys for so long as not being good enough. Now you're trying to say they are good enough. You don't know how the fans are going to take them.
And with the Roman Reigns test failure and suspension, how do you think that's going to affect his future?
It's up to Vince. I don't know. It could go either way. If Vince, you know, thinks he's still the guy, then I don't think it's going to have a long-term effect. If Vince decides, you know, I can't go with him, then, you know, but the thing he's got going is I don't think that Vince has anyone else that he truly trusts to be that guy. I don't think Roman's the guy, but for whatever reason, Vince thought he was. So that's kind of what kept him in that spotlight, even though the fans kind of booed him a lot. But if this is the straw that breaks the camel's back and he just says, I'm going to go with Seth Rollins, or I'm going to go with Dean Ambrose, or I'm going to whoever else. Yeah, that's a total Vince call.
And the last thing I was going to ask you about, this is, you may or may not know this, you probably do. What was Bill Eadie's legal situation with WWE?
In the sense of?
There was some sort of lawsuit.
Yeah. They sued over the demolition name and things like that. And I don't remember how it exactly ended, but yeah. There was a lot. Bill Eadie and Randy Colley, I think, sued Vince.
And this is why they're not in the Hall of Fame, most likely.
Who knows with Vince? But you know, Vince does get over stuff. So, you know, Warrior was put in the Hall of Fame, but it was, you know, it was also a business move. I mean, Warrior was going to mean more for business than demolition would mean. So could it affect it? You know, yeah. I mean, you look at the new lawsuit that was just filed. You know, I mean, obviously everybody on that lawsuit, until they take their name off that lawsuit, they're not going in the Hall of Fame. Every single one of them. So now some of them are already in, and I don't know. I mean, I don't see Vince like scratching Orndorff out, but we'll see.
Oh, speaking of people being scratched out, what did you think of Hulk Hogan being scratched out of the Hall of Fame?
Well, I mean, he's still technically in. They've just erased everything. I think the day will come when, you know, as soon as they feel that it's blown over, he'll be back, you know, on the list and everything. I think it's just a timing thing. And, you know, I think they've already decided that at some point, it's just a question of, do we want to alienate sponsors or whatever the problem is. If we get the wrong sponsor and goes, hey, he said this.
And just finally, you want to plug your podcast?
Yeah. So just go to www.wrestlingobserver.com, and we have a podcast multi-times a week. I do the Wrestling Observer newsletter every week. It's the insider's guide to everything in pro wrestling and MMA as well. And business news and everything like that, behind the scenes news. And yeah, the podcast after every big show and several times a week, me and Brian Alvarez break everything down, and so that's the deal.
And do you have a Twitter?
At Dave Meltzer, WON.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate all the information.